Welcome back to the AMR Roundtable on Overtures discussion for the 2026 PCA General Assembly. This is our third video, and in this segment, we're going to be talking about overtures dealing with judicial matters and administrative and polity matters. If you missed the first two parts, go find those at the AMR YouTube channel or on the Substack. But we're going to dive right in. I've got Dr. David Coffin and Dr. Steve Tipton and Howie Donahoe here, and they've been great sharing their thoughts so far. So we're going to dive into what they think about some of the judicial overtures that were sent up this year. We're going to start with Overture 27 from Westminster. And this is coming back to an issue that's had some discussion for a number of years, but we've never really had any resolution on it, and that's the issue of assumption of original jurisdiction. So, Howie, I'm going to let you speak to that first.
Yeah, I've tried to get overtures passed at least twice in the last 20 years to fix this thing. As it is right now, because it says if a lower court refuses to act, and that's a phrase is a little too vague. I think it should say something more specific and measurable, like declines to indict. But if we do that, then we need to bump the threshold up much higher than 2 presbyteries. I suggest 20% of the presbyteries instead of 2. We had a case a few years ago out of a Midwest presbytery that caused a lot of turmoil. If this chapter had been fixed, it would not have caused as much turmoil. So I'll probably try to move to amend this. I don't like it in its current form by any means, but I do like the idea of trying to fix 34.1 to make it reasonable. And it's going to be hard to find out where that perfect spot is in order to get 58 presbyteries to approve it. But I think there's got to be a spot of some sort, and it's probably how high or low should the threshold be, probably.
Yeah, Steve, I think you were on the same page on that. Something about an amendment. What do you think?
Yeah, so I'm not certain what that number is, right? Percentage-wise. Like, I mean, so let's say that 70% of the PCA would be happy with 15%, and Howie's the lone person who votes against it because he thinks it's too low. Like, that's the issue, and he's shaking his head. But my point is like, try to figure out what that delta is going to be important. And perhaps I'm also concerned about the procedure, because it makes it sound like, as it's written, that it goes to the General Assembly, but it also doesn't say how. Does the Assembly get to vote in the summer on whether or not to assume original jurisdiction? What does that discussion look like? How does that go? So in that sense, if it is envisioned as a discussion and a vote at the General Assembly, then maybe a lower number is fair. But if it's saying it just automatically goes to the SJC and they automatically take it up, that's a different issue. But contrary to how he's shaking his head, I mean, it just says it may assume, right, as written right now. So I mean, it's somewhat confusing to me what the procedure is. I'm not all that interested in a discussion on the floor of the Assembly about the potential sins of a man, and then we all get to vote on whether or not, as the largest grand jury ever or whatever. So I think it's an important part of our polity, but I agree it's unworkable as written, and it's just trying to figure out where the consensus can be on creating something that could work. I also think it's helpful that it's somewhat downstream from the issues that Howie was talking about, that this isn't about an individual. This isn't, let's change the BCO so that we can finally get Howie Donahoe, who we've all, desired. Well, but that's not what this is about. So let's try to figure out what is a proper way of doing it. So that's all.
So it'd be less reactive because there's not a particular case everyone's chomping at the bit for, right? Yes. David, you have thoughts on this? I know you've been thinking about original jurisdiction. I remember from several years ago. What do you think about this?
I think both 34.1 and 33.1 are a serious mistake. 34.1 is a novelty in terms of Presbyterian polity. It was invented when the PCA came into existence. We lived for 80. Well, in any case, we lived for a long time, and 33.1 didn't have that provision in sessions and elders. It came in that ad interim committee on restructure that I was unhappy to have served on. And I think both of them are a serious mistake. I think that all of them almost demand a denial of due process. What's the evidentiary standard for people hearing what's going on in a presbytery? And how is that evidence then presented to the court above that would have original jurisdiction? We have other means to the fact it came out of one case in the old Southern Church. I'm not going to be able to bring his name up. The great historian of the Southern Church at Union Seminary. In any case, he had gone off the rails, people thought, in his doctrine, and his presbytery protected him. They wouldn't, and they couldn't get at it. And so that was all on their minds, and they wanted some means like that. And that's where 34.1 came from. With the 40-5, we have a way to get at a matter if we need to, with reports that have to be credible and so on. We don't need this business of presbyteries ganging up. I mean, one presbytery thinks they've got the evidence and they start to spread it around. Well, then for the other, next presbytery down, it's secondhand. It's hearsay. I think this is a really bad idea to even have it as it is. And I think this version of it that's being proposed makes it even worse.
It does seem like 40-5 has been like this new discovery in the PCA where everyone realized there's this mechanism, and that kind of took the heat off of original jurisdiction questions for a while, but we did still have this one. Okay, what about Overture 16 from Southwest Florida, clarifying circularization of the court regarding complaints?
I love it.
You love it. Okay, go for it.
Yeah. I mean, it actually came up in an SJC case that we had. And the book presently says if there's a complaint filed at Presbytery, for example, nobody can circulate any pros and cons prior to the consideration of that at the Presbytery meeting, which seems to be counterproductive to discussion. What the author of the Overture, I think, rightly identified was it's the appellate court that you can't circularize, not the original court. If my presbytery is considering a matter, because a complaint to the original court is essentially just a motion to amend something previously adopted. Well, so if I file it and I call it motion to amend something previously adopted, everybody can circulate whatever they want. If I call it a complaint, they can't, even though the consideration of it is going to be the same. So I think it's a very helpful fix of the BCO.
I think you other gentlemen seem to agree with that. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes.
All right. Well, then let's move on to Overture 28. This is about members' complaints in a session referenced matter. And it looked like two of you supported it, but David, looks like you were thinking no on this one. So why don't you guys first speak to it? Steve, do you want to speak to it and why you think it might be a good idea?
I could try. So I will say David's comments have certainly given me much pause for thought. But so obviously, reference takes a matter from a court of original jurisdiction and transfers it to a higher. And while that in and of itself is not an insignificant matter, right? Because one of the things you're doing is you're losing a level of appeal when you do that. So it's not as bad when a session goes to presbytery. It's dramatically different when presbytery sends something to the SJC, as happened with Lake Central Indiana. There's no appeal. It just is what it is, or even complaint for that matter, even if it was found not guilty or whatever. So I understand the differences. One of the things that I'm more concerned about, and this maybe has more to do with the session than it does with the presbytery, is oftentimes when you have a session level, let's say a trial, for instance, and you have all of these ruling elders who've been dealing with the issue pastorally, informal discipline for a while, and then it gets to the point where you need to actually take the steps of formal discipline, and all of them are so intricately involved in everything that's been going on that they feel maybe they're the ones that say, look, we're not sure we can do a trial properly, or maybe there's only two of us and one of us has to be the prosecutor and the other has to be, well, how are we going to handle this? And so they send it up to the presbytery. Well, now that individual has no right to complain. I mean, obviously that's an appeal, that's slightly different, but those issues, it could be easy to just, and that issue I can see where it's understandable why it's being referenced. But if somebody looks at this and gets wise to the fact that, well, if I just reference it to presbytery, this guy no longer has standing, then it could be used in a nefarious, so to speak, way to send it to presbytery, because no matter what happens, none of my people can complain about it. I'm not suggesting anybody ever has nefarious motives in the PCA, but I think it showed a potential loophole that could be closed. And whether it just needs to be clarified, amended, or whatever, I think the sentiment is good. Whether or not it's well written may be a different question. But I think to try to preserve that right of complaint when those actions are referenced, I think could be helpful.
I've reviewed enough cases in 28 years on the SJC. I don't want to give anybody a loophole.
Well, you wonder how somebody even thought of this unless there was a situation where,
Yeah, and reference matters are very rare. In my 40 years as an elder, I've only voted in favor of accepting a reference once, and it was a Central Indiana case because that presbytery, it was challenging for them, and they asked us to take it up. I don't know why you would take at the presbytery, why you would accept a complaint reference from the session. Just say, no, you guys deal with it. They said, well, we're divided. I said, I don't care. You take a vote. How many guys, and if the complainant isn't satisfied, they bring it to us. Why would we take your complaint? I can't imagine accepting a complaint from a session as a reference.
Well, I don't think that's the issue, though. I mean, it would fall into the category of it, but it's really, in one sense, any time a session references something to the presbytery, any kind of difficult decision, whether it's a judicial case or it is some other issue that they're struggling with. So it wouldn't exclude the option to reference a complaint, but I think that's only one of the options, not even the primary one necessarily.
David, do you have any thoughts on this one?
I'm opposed to it. I think in the nature of the case, a reference changes all of the rights and responsibilities that people have, and some are lost. And it's a trade-off. They're lost because they hope to have the higher court be able to handle something they couldn't handle. But why you should try and reconstitute one group's rights and responsibilities when there are many more in what happens with a complaint. But further, a complaint is defined as opposition to an act of a court by one under that jurisdiction. These people are not under that jurisdiction. It violates the very nature of a complaint as we have it in 43.1. So I think, and I also think, and maybe that's what, I'm not sure whether this is what Howie was getting at, but it may well be, Steve, I agree with you, that someone might say, oh, well, here's good technique to get out of responsibility. We'll send up complaints to the presbytery. But I don't think our presbytery has ever received a complaint. And if there was any hint that it was actually being done as a technique to avoid responsibility, I'm sure the presbytery wouldn't do it. So I hope that this does not pass.
Okay, let's jump over to Overture 69, which is about clarifying the contents of the record in a judicial case. I wanted to give David a chance to speak to this one.
This is really a very fine piece of work. The SJC has struggled time and time again with the fact that there are instructions in various places in the rules of discipline that talk about the record that are not entirely consistent right now. You can interpretively make them consistent, and the SJC has had to do that in decisions. But folk who are trying to figure out, the clerks of sessions are trying to figure out what their responsibilities are, could easily be confused. And we've had to do some serious things dealing with records of the case. And I'm sure this is Jim who prepared this. Do you think, Howie? Yeah.
I'm sure it is.
He's a lawyer on the SJC, and he has had to face on panels a number of these cases. And I think he's done an outstanding job in bringing the whole thing into consistency. If I'm misreading that, Steve or Howie, I'm glad to hear it, but I think he's done a very good job.
Yeah, I think it's great.
Okay, sounds like everyone's in favor of that. Let's talk about Overture 35 briefly. This is about establishing a deadline for issuing indictments. So we talked about there's a particular case where there was a long delay recently, and that's the occasion for this one. What do y'all think about this?
Well, I don't think it can stand as written because if the prosecutor doesn't bring an indictment in 60 days, it says you have to appoint a new prosecutor. Well, now that guy's got to get up to speed, so it doesn't really expedite anything. I think that's the first time in my time on the SJC where I've seen this be an issue in a case. So maybe it's, trying to fix that one-off thing that, but if we were going to fix it, I'd rather see if the indictment isn't brought within X number of days, the court has to drop the charges. So whether that's 90 days or 120 days, but the idea of just, what if that second prosecutor doesn't bring the indictment? Let's say it's complicated. It's hard to get hold of the key witnesses. And now it's another 60-day passes and they appoint the third prosecutor. So I don't think the solution proposed by Ileana, although I've spoken to the author, I think he's planning to bring in an amendment of some sort to the Overtures Committee. He's on the Overtures Committee, so we'll see.
Steve, you have a thought?
Yeah, I mean, again, I echo what Howie said. Again, I'm not necessarily keen on all of the different pieces and parts, but I think having some sort of deadline is important. And I think it would be wise to push it out far enough that the only thing it's going to catch is, situations where a presbytery is just not doing its job versus this is complex. It's going to take more than 60 days or whatever. But, in theory, you could have, a pretrial suspension, not by way of censure, indefinitely, while a prosecutor and a presbytery is willing to allow it to go on. Or you end up having to complain about it and then having to deal with that whole complaint process. So,
David, do you have a thought?
No, I'm against it. I know I hadn't realized there was one instance. I've never seen an instance beyond that, but I don't think we ought to change the book because we have one renegade prosecutor.
Then 067 from Potomac is about preliminary requirements before citing the court to appear regarding a 40-5 report. So my understanding is this came up because like I said, we've had a lot more 40-5s come up recently. A lot of those have been going to RPR. There's been confusion about exactly what the process is and what the standard is. And it sounds like this is at least aimed at trying to clarify some of that. What do you guys think about this approach? Howie and Steve, it looks like y'all are in favor, and David, you were thinking no.
Well, I mean, this is the process that RPR has used for a number of years, right? We make a recommendation to the assembly to find that it is a credible report and that it reports an important delinquency or grossly unconstitutional act. I think that the language of 40-5 is relatively clear in the sense that that's what needs to happen. I'm actually not in favor of it.
Okay.
Maybe, yeah, I don't think it's necessary. So I think that it's clear enough in the statute that that's if that's the kind of report you're supposed to be acting on, then it seems incumbent to me that you would make those two determinations on some level, whether it's formal or informal. You have to decide it's credible and it meets a particular standard. I wouldn't. I'm not saying that I would necessarily fight hard against it. I just don't think it's necessary, and I don't. It's not high on my list of really important overtures. So,
why don't you go next, and then David, you can respond finally.
Part of me thinks it's important because of the number of 40-5 letters that were flying around this year. I agree with Stephen that it seems like a no-brainer that you would try to decide, well, is what being alleged an important delinquency? Or, you take a vote or you have a commission or a committee that's empowered to do this, to say, listen, somebody's alleging my session doesn't use hymnals. It fails on question one right there, right? So we don't do anything else. Is there sufficient evidence provided to support the allegation? Well, you'd want that. You'd probably call whoever's sending the letter and say, how do you know that session didn't consider that? Or how do you know that? So I don't mind codifying it. I think it'd probably be helpful to codify it. It doesn't give presbyteries less freedom. It just makes it clear to any court that thinks you shouldn't do those two things before citing. I mean, if a presbytery doesn't do those two things and they cite a session to respond, they're probably going to regret that they didn't do those two things first. So I think it's a good idea.
Okay. David, what do you think about this?
I think the language that's there is perfectly appropriate, but if we change it, then a established history of judicial construction is gone, and we've got a whole new set of words and to interpret, and who knows how they're going to be interpreted when there is a conflict and people are all looking for ways to get around this, that, or the other, which always happens in judicial interpretation. It's not only the current language, but it's the history of the interpretation of that language is so full and finished. I don't see any reason to abandon that tradition and have to start all over again.
Does the history support this language as the proper steps to take? Oh, okay.
Well, it supports the current language that's in the book. We don't know whether it supports this new language because that's going to have to be construed. That's the whole point.
You're talking about
my
the phrase
question. My
credible
question is:
report.
has it been construed this way historically?
It has been construed consistent with the language that's in the book now. We don't have any construction of
I
the
want
new.
this new language. That
Okay.
Well, Derek, I
So-
was going to say I might be in favor of amending it if we add a sentence at the bottom that says this is not a quick route to take to deal with the matter. Please be advised you might wait up to a year before anything happens on your report or something along those lines, because people think 40-5. I'll get an answer next week from the assembly that they've kicked such and such presbytery out of the denomination because of what I reported. So,
okay. David, you're talking about the language of credible report. You're saying that has a history in our denomination, how that's been understood. Is that what you're referring to?
Precisely. But not just credible report. Credible report, it has to be either a serious defect or a gross.
Yeah. Important delinquency or grossly unconstitutional proceeding.
Right. So important delinquency, that's construed to be a sin of omission, but one that is very significant. And gross delinquency or gross
unconstitutional proceeding
is a sin of commission. And that has to be a major sin, not any kind of minor things. That's the construction of it. And but with this new language, we're going to start a new interpretive tradition. And I don't think there's any reason to roll the dice to hope that it's going to be as solid as it is right now.
Okay, I could be wrong, but it's my understanding is that language is still in the proposal, but I could be wrong about that.
Well, it is, but it's in a different
place.
Find me the number we're talking about.
We're on
Overture
67.
67. I mean, it retains the original phrasing in the first paragraph and then repeats it in 1 and 2. What it's trying to avoid, I think, is a court that when they get a 40-5 letter, the first thing they do is cite the lower court to appear. And that seems precipitous. The overture seems to be saying you've got to decide what kind of a category of an allegation it is, and is there sufficient evidence to support it, and then you can cite them to appear.
There are when a report comes to the higher court under the current language, it has to be understood to be credible. That's the first thing.
Right.
You've taken that away. Now you're receiving just any report. No, just wait a minute. Now you're receiving any report, but you have to follow these determinations. But it doesn't really have you under 1 and 2 paying attention to grossly unconstitutional proceedings and important delinquency. It introduces, well, in fact, it reverses the order. It has grossly unconstitutional be first, and sufficient evidence isn't exactly the same thing as credible. That's a different meaning.
Yeah, that's where I think that is where the big change is they've stricken credible report, and then they've specified the type of support or a report it needs to be advanced. Yeah. So, okay.
Well, I think it's amendable. It does use credible only in front of the word source, which is different than credible report. But I think you could unstrike credible in the first line and leave that in and flip 1 and 2. But so I think it's amendable, but I think it tries to address the situation where this happened in Pittsburgh Presbytery, where a session got cited to appear and answer, and they got there, and Presbytery realized, well, it wasn't a important delinquency or gross unconstitutional proceeding, or it wasn't a credible report, and now a session had been cited to appear and answer, and it seemed like it was jumping the gun, I guess.
All
I'm
right.
sure
let
the
me-
only thing I
good
want to
intent.
add is that there is something added to it, right? And I think somebody mentioned it before, but just to underline it, that it's adding sufficient evidence provided to support the allegation. Whether or not that is included in the concept of a credible report is a debatable question, but it certainly is adding a standard that is not currently there. So,
But let me just
Okay.
say, I'm sure there's nothing but good intentions behind this because it came from Potomac Presbytery.
All right.
yes.
Okay. Well, let's, I think we're going to skip over Richard 46. I think all of you said no to that. That's about public allegations online and kind of going to charges. And everyone said that's not a good idea. So I'm going to say, is there anything else under judicial overtures y'all want to talk about? Otherwise, we're going to skip. There's quite a few other ones that we're not even going to speak to that y'all didn't seem to think were worth commenting on. Okay. All right. Well, then we'll address here in our last part overtures that deal with administrative issues and polity issues. So one that stood out that seemed like a number of folks thought was worth talking about was Overture 59, a non-judicial removal of a member from the role at their request. I think, Howie, you said this is an important one. Do you want to speak to that?
I don't think it can pass 58 presbyteries. This kind of gets way back to the Chen case back in the dinosaur days. David will remember that case. The paragraph presently says the scenario in the present wording is that when he's affiliated with that other entity, and this changes when he's affiliated or says he plans to affiliate. And I have lukewarm sympathy, but some sympathy for it.
Okay, you other guys did not want to see this one pass, if I understand you correctly.
No.
Steve, you want to speak to that?
Well, maybe David, because I think it was his comment that sort of flipped me.
Okay,
Anyway,
David,
so
what do you
maybe
think?
David could start.
Well, a church member doesn't have the right to have his church membership dissolved immediately. That's just simple. So the whole premise of the problem they want to solve is a valid premise. And furthermore, if the church doesn't delay until he has actually attempted to or accomplished moving into another denomination, it can't fulfill its obligation to determine whether it's some other branch of the visible church or whether it's heretical church is required under the matter, or whether it's a church at all. So I think this would be a serious mistake.
I think my
the only thing I would add to that,
my pragmatism gets in front of my principles. So,
well, it's okay. But the other thing I would add is that this kind of creates a hybrid of 38.4 or 38.3 and 38.4, because prior to the amendment, he is, I mean, whether attempt is the right word, but he is actually affiliated with some other branch of the visible church. He is a member there. If you're going to remove him from your roles on the basis of his intention, you have excommunicated him for a period of time. And maybe it doesn't work out. I intended to do this, but it didn't work out. That church collapsed the next Sunday or something along those lines. Now you have an individual that is excommunicated while, at least prior to them actually affiliating they are at least still part of the visible church. They're members of your church. So I think from what David said, and then the fact that it's a functional excommunication while somebody's just looking for another church. And I would also say that a member's lack of understanding, I'll say it politely, of our polity doesn't create a crisis for us, right? They're not understanding what it means to not be a member in good standing of an evangelical church. Doesn't create a responsibility for me to simply transfer them to nothing because they don't want to be a member of our church anymore. That's more of a 38.4 thing. And if that's where they are, then do 38.4 versus 38.3a. So.
Okay. Overture 13 deals with commissions by sessions. And it seemed like several of you thought this needed to be amended or just no altogether. I'm going to go with no first. So, David, I think you said, no, we don't need this.
Right. I think that the wording of this is not up to what would be needed in such an amendment. If you allow a commission to be made up of 2 members, the quorum proposed would allow 1 member to act as a commission. A session is a deliberative body. A commission is a smaller deliberative body. 1 person is not a smaller portion of the body and can't be a deliberative body. So and I think the BCO affirms this. Let me say, Robert's Rules thinks you can have a committee of 1. And they don't say anything about commissions at all. But that's partly what the Roberts reference has to do with. But our BCO says if there's only 1 ruling elder, he does not constitute a session, even though he should take spiritual oversight of the church and report to the presbytery any matter needing the action of a church court. So if 1 elder can't be the session, surely 1 elder can't be a session commission.
Howie, what are you thinking about this?
Well, the overture says a quorum is the greater of 2 elders or 1/2 the membership of the commission. So it could never be less than 2. My concern with this is, I mean, when I was on the session at Christ Covenant, we had 44 ruling elders. We had commissions. I mean, it just, but I think 2 is too small. If you're going to have a judicial commission, you have to have at least 3. I'd probably make a judicial commission a quorum of 3. I mean, I don't think it allows a commission of 1. I do think it needs some amending. I would say at least 3 with a quorum of 2, but even then, in a judicial case, I can't imagine less than 3. So I think it's doable, but it needs to be tweaked.
Steve, what were you going to say? Oh, go ahead, David.
Yeah, well, so I think it would be helpful to add a statement that exempts this from judicial commissions. I think the idea behind this is that there's lots of things that churches can do. I mean, even sometimes smaller churches will have would love to be able to send 2 ruling elders to do a membership interview, perhaps, right? I mean, is it impossible for the whole session then to meet? No, but under certain circumstances where you might want 2 men to be able to not just discuss in a matter, but to take action. I think the fact that both David and I, maybe it was just the volume of reading, read it in such a way that you could have a commission of just 1 person. Maybe it needs to be clearer, or we just need to read more clearly. But I think that's something that needs to be cleared up, so it's crystal clear that you can't have a commission. The quorum for that commission cannot be less than 2 under no circumstances. And that means if you have 2 elders, then they both have to do all the work, and I think that's fine. but I'm not opposed to the idea. I think it could be helpful, and certainly the notion that it doesn't that the parity at the session level, I don't think is as important as it is at a presbytery level or at an assembly level. So I'm in favor of the removal of the concept of the parity, but tweaks are always a good thing. So,
David, what were you going to follow up on?
I'm content. That's
Okay. Okay. What about Overture 1 from Potomac about assistant pastor or assistant pastors succeeding the senior pastor? I think it lowers the threshold, if I remember correctly, about the vote that's needed. David, what do you think? You're laughing.
I'm laughing because the first amendment that I ever proposed to the PCA Book of Church Order was on this section. And the current standard is the standard that I wrote. The
finally got around to fixing it.
And the reason why I wrote it that way, very high on both congregational and presbytery majorities, is because the earlier language said absolutely couldn't happen without an intervening term of service. First Church Columbia stole our senior pastor where I was serving as a ruling out. And we would have all happily loved to have our associate take the senior's position. The whole church would have done it unanimously. But we had just come into the PCA, and the rule was you can't do it. And so I wrote it, and I knew that there were people that feared if you allowed this, you would set up a case where associates would try and take over for the senior and undermine them. So I knew it had to have a very high standard to pass, and that's why I wrote it that way. Well, it finally did pass, although too late for us because First Church Columbia stole our associate pastor as well.
no bitterness detected whatsoever.
But but since that time, the thing's been in place, it's been used, and there's never been a case of an associate being accused of trying to undermine a senior, even though he could follow immediately. And so one of the men in our presbytery came to me and said, look, this is hard for us to do at this level, and we could lower it, and it would still be a very wholesome thing. And so we talked about it, and we said, let's have a go at it and make it a little easier, since it doesn't seem to be a real threat anymore. That's the point.
All right, Steve, you have a different view.
Yeah, well, I look at it from an entirely different perspective. 80% is not a high bar. 80% to me is a very low bar for a vote of a congregation to receive me as a pastor. I don't think I would take a church if I only got 80% of the congregation voting in favor of me. So I understand what David is saying, but when people talk about 80% as a high bar, it's not a high bar. 80% is a low bar to me. I don't have a problem with. Now, that said, I understand the difference between my personal feelings about a high and a low bar and putting it in the BCO. This is the number you have to jump over. But that language concerns me, that we're of high versus low bar. I've been in a church, the church I previously served in, the serving associate pastor at the time failed to reach that bar by one vote at a congregational meeting. Now, they did eventually call him, but they called a pulpit committee. The pulpit committee did a national search, and they came back and said, no, this is the best guy. And I thought all along, I thought he was the best guy. But I've at least seen one situation where that guy didn't get the vote. And again, in that situation, it wasn't because they didn't like him. is because they thought I think they were getting a guy sort of shoved down their throat versus the national search piece. So I'm not entirely opposed to changing it, but it's just that language of low or high bar just gets to me. That's it. And maybe that's a personal thing that I just need to get over. But I think the bigger issue is the presbytery on a certain level, right? Because if a congregation wants to call a guy and he's done a really good job of getting rid of the previous pastor, then the congregation is going to love him and they're all going to vote for him. And it requires, in that sense, I think the higher court, to make that determination potentially before the congregation votes. But anyway, so that's all I wanted to say.
Well, and sometimes it's easy to just pick up the phone, talk to the senior pastor and say, how did this all go down? And he can tell you, or he could decide not to tell you, but that's going to tell you a whole lot more than the votes. So,
okay, we got to move along.
I think I like number one. Okay,
yeah. Let's move along to Overture 55 from Southwest Florida about the tenure of assistant pastors. I think all of you opposed this, but I think it's worth noting because this question of the role of an assistant pastor and what it plays in our polity keeps coming up in various ways over different years. Why should this not be voted in favor?
I would say because I would like the freedom as a session member to hire an assistant pastor and keep him assistant pastor forever.
Okay.
I'm not particularly fond of the office of associate pastor. I've seen a lot of SJC cases where an associate and a senior get sideways, and you got to call a congregational meeting to, you reach a financial agreement with the associate. He submits a letter of resignation, but he's not immediately going to another call. People think that smells funny. They want to know what's going on. And I'm a big fan of assistant pastors. So this might be tied for my least favorite overture.
Okay. All right. David, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I have been an assistant pastor, but I don't think there's any biblical warrant for that office at all. But we have it, and I think that I wanted to be an assistant pastor because I wanted my associate to follow, and I knew if I became an associate and had to go to session meetings, that he'd never be able to lead the session. So I needed the assistant pastor to not be a member of the session so that transition could work right. But otherwise, I don't think there's any biblical warrant with it. I just live with it. But I'm not opposed to it because of that. I think that there's a complete misunderstanding here of what the preliminary principles have in view in 9. The assistant pastor doesn't govern in the sense of preliminary practice principle 6, and therefore there is no need that he have the consent of the non-governed. That's my point.
Steve, well, I think part of that is the sort of overreach in the overture that by preaching that is an authoritative act, that performing an authoritative act automatically means that you have authority, because number one, any guest preacher now under this idea would need the consent of the governed before he performs that authoritative act on a particular Sunday. The other thing it made mention of, well, these guys have votes at presbytery, these guys have votes at GA. They're engaging in the governance of the church. We'll take that to another logical extension. No RUF minister should have a vote at presbytery because they've never been consented by any governed. nor any church planner per se, or a missionary on the field, or a guy teaching seminary. There's a whole lot of people. And also even just the concept that, well, there's men at the General or Presbytery that my members didn't vote on that exercise governance over them. Well, forget about RUF pastors. The church down the street has ruling elders and teaching elders that go to Presbytery, and nobody in my congregation voted for them. So that whole thing seemed very odd to me as well. But then the other thing is that there is this kind of undercurrent, and it was more prevalent last year. I think it might have been changed a little bit this year in the Overture, this idea that assistant pastors are just wrong and bad, and they shouldn't be doing this because it contradicts a preliminary principle. And my thought is, well, if it contradicts a preliminary principle, you shouldn't have them for 5 years or 5 minutes. It either does or it doesn't. And it's not, well, it's okay, we can stomach or hold our nose for 5 years, even though this contradicts a preliminary principle, and then we have to make a change to it. And I suppose, I mean, the other thing is, I would say, is that no man is ever actually forced to take a call as an assistant pastor if he's principally opposed to it. No session is required to call a man if they disagree with it. This seems to me to be, we don't like it and we want to force everybody else to do the same thing, even though that forcing really, either it is a biblical principle and nobody should do it, or it's a matter of Christian prudence and each individual court should make a determination as to whether or not they do it.
I'd like to speak up for the ruling elder union, since I'm the only ruling elder on this call. There seems to be almost an undercurrent idea that every teaching elder is qualified to be a session member. So if a 24-year-old guy finishes his MDiv and we hire him to do a staff job, he must be on the session. Never been married, doesn't have kids. I can't evaluate what kind of a husband he is, what kind of a father he is. Why would I put him on the session? I wouldn't put him on the session. I can't evaluate those critically important things. I was ordained as an elder at age 30, and I tell people that was 10 years too early for me. I wouldn't put a guy on the session just because he has an MDiv. No way.
All right, guys, I want to move us along to wrap us up here with just 2 more, and then if there's others you want to tackle. But let's talk about Overture 49 from Northwest Georgia, which is to increase ruling elder representation at Presbytery and General Assembly. All 3 of you, I think, said no, and one of you even said this is really bad. So I'll just leave that up to you guys to tackle. Who wants to speak to this?
I don't think we should waste time on it. It's a very bad idea.
Okay.
And it'll never pass. So,
David, do you want to say anything about it? We don't have to say anything more if that's all that needs to be said.
I just think it doesn't make any sense. We have 2 entitlements now for a church of a particular size, and we're not getting enough ruling elders. So we're going to add another entitlement? How is that going to get more ruling elders? I don't.
You're going to get more ruling elders when you start having General Assembly and airline hubs.
All right, that's another one of Howie's soapboxes there, right? All right.
Pet project.
All right, last one then. I think this is kind of a repeat of last year, Overture 68 from Catawba on committee and agency appointees not getting a vote on the administrative committee. Didn't we deal with this last year, or is there a slight difference?
It may be slightly different, but I don't think it's substantially different.
Last year, a similar overture was referred to all the permanent committees and the agency boards, as it is this year. Last year, 8 of the 10 committee of commissioners supported the permanent committee and the agency boards by answering James River 9 in the negative. RUF committee commissioners didn't vote on it, and surprisingly, MTW committee commissioners voted to affirm it by a vote of 29 to 21. Nobody wants this. Except the 29 guys on one committee of commissioners.
Well, I mean, for me, I think this goes back to something I said, in the previous, that this is a feature of our permanent committees and agencies, and so while it does, to a certain degree, you might say it dilutes the voting power of the actual members who were elected by the assembly to the administrative committee. And I get that argument that that's true, but the question then becomes, is that of necessity bad? When you have a committee like AC that deals with matters that extend beyond, it extends into the entirety of the denomination. I mean, it'd be one thing if we said every committee gets a voting member on every other committee. Like, okay, I could understand why that would be a bad thing. M&A or MTW now all of a sudden gets 11 or whatever extra members that go in from these other committees, or 9, I suppose, that go in. But admin of its nature deals with issues that are of the entire assembly, but also the denomination. And to have those men on there as voting members is fine. I don't think there's necessarily any problem with that. I think this kind of just goes back to people reacting to something that sounds like it is intended to stack a deck or something along those lines, and that's I don't see that as the necessary result of this process. It's a potential result, sure, but it's not a necessary consequence of having agency appointees be voting members of the AC. And so unless there's a clearer argument against it, I don't think it's all that important. And plus, it failed last year. Unless there's some new major thing that I don't know about that's going to bring this as a wave, and all of a sudden it's going to get passed. And if memory serves, this is a BCO amendment. Even so, I mean, it's not just that it has to pass one assembly. Now it has to pass 2 assemblies and 2/3 of presbyteries. So I just don't see it as it's not going to pass. So there's not really even any real reason to discuss it and to try to push it forward.
I think the other thing to remember is that none of the permanent committee or agency board appointees were unelected by the assembly. They were all elected by the assembly with the full knowledge that maybe they become an appointee to the AC. I mean, it's maybe not that clear to everybody, but they weren't just appointed by the seminary board. They were appointed by the GA elected seminary board. So,
yep. All right. Are there any other administrative or polity overtures that y'all think we need to discuss?
Could I offer one last word on this subject?
Please, David.
If we think about it abstractly, we might have thought that it was absolutely proper for each committee and agency to prepare their own budget and present it to the assembly. That would have been the natural thing to think of. But for certain prudential reasons, we decided better to have all those budgets be handled by one committee. But then we thought, well, of course, then if we're not going to have the committees present their own budgets, certainly there ought to be somebody from the committee on the admin to represent and advocate the cause of that committee. And it seems to me like it was a perfect prudential scheme to fulfill two concerns. One, that there be a unified sense and use of the monies of the assembly, but without excluding altogether from input to that body from the committees and agencies. I don't see this as in any sense a defect. I think it's a mark of wisdom.
I'd like to put in a plug for Potomac 81, proposing to change the RAO to require wine and juice at the General Assembly Lord's Supper. I chaired the host committee in Charlotte in 2003, and I was explicitly and energetically told we could not use wine. And I thought the person with authority was being facetious, but they weren't. So we deferred to that, but it kind of shocked me and surprised me. But so I like Potomac 81.
Interesting. Okay, so backing up to RAO, I mean, I thought that one was curious. Steve, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Do you think that we should require wine to be served at General Assembly communion?
Only if Howie buys it. No,
Then I'd like to buy the cups too, because they'll be a little bit bigger.
Yeah. The only question I might have is whether facilities might have any issue with that. But even then, it's for religious purpose. I would think even in that case, it wouldn't matter. But so in that sense, maybe require is too strong a word, because what if you end up in an area where they just say flat out, you cannot bring alcoholic beverages on site altogether. But the concept of saying we're never going to serve what actually ought to be served in the Lord's Supper seems to me to be a bad idea, and certainly providing the option. I mean, not the option, but I mean, in the sense of both are present, makes sense to me.
And the first assembly we have this, I will buy the Molly Duker Blue Eyed Boy Shiraz from South Australia.
All right. Well, we've got that on
Mark my words.
So,
mark my words. I'm glad it's recorded.
All right, gentlemen, is there anything else before I close this up here? Okay. Well,
thank you for doing this.
I'm very grateful to you all. I do hope that this can be a model of how we can talk about things in the PCA. I know all of us come from different places, and we want to be able to talk about these things respectfully, charitably, assuming the best, and hopefully in a way that sharpens us so that we can discern the Spirit's work in our denomination and make wise decisions together. So I appreciate the way you guys are contributing to hopefully promoting that. And we'll all be in prayer about Louisville and the decisions we have before us there. I know you guys will be working together still to put out some comments on your overture advice, and also just even docket order. So viewers, you want to keep an eye out for those, so that can help you think about the overtures yourselves. All right. Well, thank you again, gentlemen, and thank you all for listening.
Amen.
Thank you.